In my travels across the country, more and more people are coming up to me with a very similar question. They're asking me, I want to be helpful, to make a contribution, but I just don't know how or where to begin. My answer to them is usually this: right from the start, follow your heart. I find that this answer holds true, even though we're living in a world where the messages we receive from others usually say something quite different. Don't follow your heart or you'll get hurt. It's dangerous to stick your neck out for other people. It's a tough world out there. Take care of yourself and your family, and then let others take care of themselves. In spite of these often heard warnings, more and more people are hearing an inner calling, a voice from within saying that the way to make a difference in this world is to be helpful to others. It's as if the very soul of humankind is crying out to be expressed, to be made fully alive through giving to others. This program is about people who listen to their hearts with all their might. It's about people who have truly made a significant difference. Some of these people are famous. Others are known only among their circle of friends. But you're going to see from their stories that they're all ordinary people who have done extraordinary things. In one sense, you can look upon this as a how-to program in which these people are the exceptional teachers who can offer us guidance and inspiration for one of the most simple yet profound lessons any of us can learn. To give is to receive. One of the common denominators I found in these people is that they learn to believe in themselves. They learn to turn a deaf ear to those who said that some things simply couldn't be done. None of these people believed in words such as can't or impossible. They each chose not to accept or believe in limitations of any kind. They learned to follow the fire of compassion and love that was burning in the very center of their beings, as indeed it burns in all of us. The people in this program faced many obstacles, but rather than concentrating on those problems, they focused on the solutions. Love. Their power came from trusting and having faith in love. In talking with them and getting to know them, I felt that deep inside that each one of them sensed that their own healing was somehow related to their desire and willingness to help others. None of them were people who sort of did things or merely tried to do them. These people made it their top priority to help others, and their tenacity simply would not allow anything to stand in their way. As you will see, all of them gave 100% of themselves and more. They were clear about the fact that their central motivation was to give, not to get, and that in everything they did, their purpose was to teach only love, not fear. There's a lesson in this for all of us, and I hope that by hearing their stories, you will be inspired to work it into your own lives. Perhaps the biggest limitation we can ever put on ourselves is to believe in fear rather than love. At those times in our lives when we are feeling frustration, futility, and hopelessness, we are tempted to believe that we are victims and that we must continue to suffer. Sometimes we honestly look at our situation and it truly seems like there is nothing we can do to get out of it. And in a similar way, some of us have had such horrendously painful experiences that we've adopted the belief that the past will repeat itself. We let fear and anger invade our hearts, and we live as if our only goal is to survive rather than to live. It is so difficult at those times to believe that to give really is to receive. I believe sincerely that the stories you are about to hear will help all of us to take a fresh look at ourselves and our purpose in life, so that we can recognize our uniqueness, our humanness, and the essence of love that we truly are as individuals. Each of these stories, in their own way, tell about love and compassion for our planet, for all of humankind, and for all that is living in the universe. It is important to remember that all too often our ego deceives us. It tells us that what is important in this world is how much we do or how much we accomplish. But nearly every day I'm reminded of the words of Mother Teresa, who at a time in my own life, when I was depressed and feeling that I was not accomplishing enough, told me that what was important in life was not how much we do or accomplish, but how much love we give. She said that it is our intentions that are most important, and that we experience the peace of God when our thoughts and actions come from the heart of love. Over and over again, my experiences lead me to believe that when we look at one another through the heart, a whole new reality unfolds. As we begin to re-experience ourselves as love, and as we give that love to others, we begin to have a spiritual transformation. And by that very process, the words we perceive begin to change. What had been a world filled with fear and hopelessness begins transforming into a world of love and hope. Gifts of love can never be measured. When we are giving love, there are no small or large gifts. All gifts of love are the same, boundless, complete, and non-exclusive, always expanding out without limitations. Perhaps our number one challenge is to let go of all of our fear and to ask for guidance from our higher selves each moment of each day. As we learn to listen to the answers from within, we discover how we can direct our minds in the most creative ways into having only loving thoughts, words, and actions, and to bringing more joining, love, and joy into the world. Yes, each of us can make a difference. We can make a difference when we see that our purpose in being here is to give the gift of unconditional love to all others in our lives, and when we learn to forgive. Although there have been countless articles and books on the subject of forgiveness, it's still not an easy concept for most of us to apply in practical ways. Maybe one of the difficulties is that we rarely meet anyone who demonstrates total forgiveness. I've been fortunate. I've met such a person, a woman who's become a friend, as well as an important teacher for me of what forgiveness is all about. In early 1988, I received a letter from a woman named Zelinda Carusi. Her message and her story turned out to be both unusual and important. Let me tell you about that letter. Zelinda began it by saying that she had written me many times before, but had never mailed the letters. This time, she said, she felt a real need not only to finish the letter, but to mail it. Then she went on to narrate her story, and it went like this. In August of 1979, my second son, John, who was 22 years old, was murdered. I could write a book telling how this murder changed my life and the lives of my family and friends. The man who killed John was tried, convicted, and sent to prison on second-degree murder charges. After a few years, he started the process of trying to get out of prison. When I heard about this, I fought him through the system, a battle that went on for many years. During this battle, I felt anger and pain that I'd never experienced before, and which I find difficult to explain even to this day. Zelinda told me that Her hair had begun to fall out. She developed a skin condition. She had gallbladder attacks and many other medical conditions that she began to wonder if these conditions were due to the fact that it seemed like her main purpose in life was hate and revenge. She then read one of my books, Love is Letting Go of Fear, and for the first time began to wonder, was there another way of looking at the world? Was there another purpose in life? She began listening to the inner voice, and the inner voice told her to begin to visit this person, Michael, who had committed the murder. She had trouble doing this because that person was her enemy. She then went out to the prison and shared her anger, but went to see him twice a week. And as time went on, she began to see him differently, began to see some positive things. She later became a student of A Course in Miracles, and she began a forgiveness process in a very remarkable way. She went on to tell me that I've grown not only to like him, but I wanted to help him. Sometimes I did not understand myself or what was happening. I only knew that what I was doing made me feel good, and that I'd had enough of pain and anger. She went on to say how fortunate she was because the man who had murdered her son was willing to go through this process with her, with the help of the prison psychologist. In the letter, she went on to say she wanted to know what I thought of having attitudinal healing groups in prison. She felt this was something that might be an important part of her life. Zelinda is one of the most powerful stories of forgiveness I've ever heard. She told me that in the beginning, she'd made it her number one goal in life to keep Michael, her son's murderer, in jail forever. There had been no doubt in her mind that what Michael had done was unforgivable. She spent all of her time fanning the fire of hatred and resentment. Every time Michael became eligible for parole, Zelinda was at the hearing with her friends and family, doing everything she could to keep him in jail. Through all the years that she did this, Zelinda felt that her emotions and behavior were both normal and appropriate. Zelinda began to do some of the daily workbook lessons that she had learned in the Course in Miracles. The lessons were about letting go of the past and not seeing the value in guilt and blame. She did her best to listen to the voice in her heart, a voice that was telling her to forgive, to let go of that past. As the visits continued, she began to look at Michael differently. She saw in him loving and caring qualities that allowed her to see that he had an identity beyond that of her son's murderer. With this realization of Michael's human qualities, the process of forgiveness began, and Zelinda started to do everything she could to get him released from prison. Needless to say, I was overwhelmed by Zelinda's story. One of the first questions that came to my mind was this: if one of my two sons were murdered, would I really be able to forgive his killer? My honest answer is that I'm not sure at all that I could. I have serious doubts that I could do what Zelinda did. I say, knowing this, that I have written many books on forgiveness, and I believe that we can never have true peace of mind as long as there is anyone in our lives whom we've not totally forgiven. I began to wonder, was I just fooling myself in the belief that total forgiveness is necessary for us to have peace within ourselves and in the world? When it came to personal issues, such as imagining my reaction as if one of my sons was murdered, did my mind split itself off from my beliefs and become inconsistent? Although Zelinda had told me how much my teachings had helped her look at the world differently and to learn what forgiveness was all about, in reading her letter that day, I immediately knew that she had as much or more to teach me than I had to teach her. After receiving her letter, I spoke with Zelinda on the phone several times. I just knew inside my heart that I had to meet both her and Michael. I wanted to feel the essence of their experience so that I could make it real for myself. I think I had to see Zelinda and Michael in person to quiet the doubting Thomas within myself, to prove that this was really happening. So with Zelinda's help, I made all the arrangements to fly to Boise, Idaho, and interview Zelinda and Michael at the Idaho State Penitentiary. 3 weeks later, I flew to Boise, Idaho. Zelinda met me at the airport, and we drove together to the prison for our appointment with Michael. On the way, I asked if it would be all right with her if I spent an hour alone with Michael before she joined us, and she agreed. After the usual formalities and delays, I was taken to the prison psychologist's office. A few minutes later, Michael walked in looking apprehensive and a little tense. He was 35 years old, about 5'10", and slender, and he wore a mustache. I told him how much I appreciated his agreeing to see me and asked him to tell me about himself. Here's the story that Michael shared with me that day. I was born in Los Angeles in 1954. When I was 5, my family moved to Walnut Creek, California. I went to school and was raised there until I moved to Idaho in 1976. When I was in the 8th grade, I started getting involved with drugs and marijuana at first, and then later the heavier stuff. I was drinking a lot too, and by the time I was 16, I was using heroin. I was stealing to pay for the drugs, petty theft, credit cards, burglaries, stuff like that. I got arrested for using a stolen credit card and was sentenced to 6 months in the county jail and 5 years probation. Later on, I violated probation. I was caught with possession of a narcotic outfit, and they sent me to the California Rehabilitation Center. I was released on probation in January 1976 and came to Idaho. I stopped using hard drugs, but I continued drinking. I was living with 2 other guys, and I drank heavily. I never actually blacked out, but I was pretty obnoxious and a loud drunk, and I really never knew why I was drinking. Now, after Michael talked about himself for a while, I asked him if he would tell me about the event that led to the murder. And here was the story. He went on to say, "We had just come back from a long trip, and there were 6 or 8 of us who had been drinking. We'd already killed off 2 bottles of rum, and we decided to go to a bar. John Dorchis was a bouncer there. I had known him since I came to Idaho. Anyway, we were there for a while, and I was becoming obnoxious as usual, drinking and carrying on. Well, I said something rude to one of the waitresses, and John came over and told me that if I said it again, I'd have to leave. I said it again, and he told me to get out of there. Then just as I was leaving, I turned around real quick and hit him and knocked him out. The other bouncers in the bar jumped on me and beat the living crap out of me. The cops came, and John put me under citizen's arrest. On the way to the county jail, they took me to the hospital to have my lips sewn up. I had enough money to bail myself out, so that's what I did. And then I went to a 7-Eleven store to get a burrito. On the way back, I decided to go over to John's house and tell him I was sorry for doing what I did. After all, the guy was my friend. I thought that maybe some of the other bouncers might be there, so I took my .32 caliber semi-automatic with me. I thought that, in case they were there, I could pull the gun out, fire a couple of shots in the air, and scare them enough so they wouldn't want to beat me up again. Then I figured I could beat a quick retreat out to my car. Of course, I was under the influence of alcohol, and I wasn't thinking clearly. That was just one of the long line of mistakes I made that night. The front door to the house was open, and I went in. I could hear John talking to a friend in the bedroom. I heard him tell his friend, so I put him in jail. I walked in the room and said, "Oh, so you put me in jail, huh?" John jumped off the bed and said, "I'll put you in jail again." I fired my gun in the air twice as a warning. He came after me and we began to fight. He pulled off my glasses and hit my right hand, the one holding the gun. As he grabbed my hand, the gun went off, shooting him in the arm, the chest, the stomach, and the head. He fell on top of me, and I just pushed him off of me. I got up and I ran as fast as I could. I jumped in my car and drove all the way to Walnut Creek, California. The next day, I decided to fly back to Boise, Idaho, where I got a lawyer and turned myself in. I was sentenced for second-degree murder. They gave me a life sentence and a consecutive 15 years for possession of a firearm while committing a felony. Michael went on to tell me that after turning himself in, the hardest part was dealing with his guilt and self-esteem. He wanted to face up to what he'd done, but he couldn't. During the trial, he listened to what people were saying. As you might imagine, he didn't like what he was hearing about himself. He was so distraught that he assumed that he would never get out of prison. He thought that even though he might become eligible for parole, they would never let him out. I asked Michael how he dealt with his guilt after the trial. How did he deal with it while he was in prison? And Michael went on to say, I just suffered. There seemed to be nothing I could do about it. I thought about committing suicide on numerous occasions. I had been in jail for 9 years without much hope when Zelinda contacted me. I have been very much a loner in prison. Michael went on to tell me that he was very surprised when he learned that Zelinda wanted to visit him. Even though his lawyer advised him not to see her, Michael went ahead and did it anyway. He said that when Zelinda came out and eventually forgave him, it was like the weight of the world had been taken off his shoulders. At this point in the interview, Zelinda joined us, and I asked her if she would go over the events that led to her contacting Michael. I've already described to you how Zelinda's change of heart began when she read the books Love is Letting Go of Fear and A Course in Miracles. But there was more to the story. Here's how she described it. It was a long process, but I remember one time being in the courtroom at one of Michael's requests for a reduction of sentence. I was on the stand testifying once again why I thought the sentence should not be reduced. While I was up there, I decided that this time I was going to look directly at Michael and try to make him feel uncomfortable. But Michael maintained eye contact with me, and that surprised me. Somehow, I thought he was trying to tell me he was sorry that this had all happened. Earlier, my son Greg and I had written a letter saying that we knew that Michael's parents had suffered and wanted him out as much as we wanted him in. As the hearing ended, I sensed Michael's parents behind me. I turned around and shook their hands and told them that I had always known that they too were suffering, that it wasn't just our side of the family. By this time, we were all crying, and Michael's mother put her arms around me and gave me a hug and said that I had been in her prayers every day. After this, there was a little voice in my heart that said, "Forgive, just do it." I'd argue with myself, and I'd say, you can't do this. Your family's going to think you're crazy. Your people are going to think you're nuts. But I just decided that I had to do it, regardless of how they felt. I told Zelinda that it seemed to me that most people think it's sane to continue to hate someone and insane to choose to forgive and love. I then said to Michael that it must have been the last thing he expected, that the mother of the person he killed would come and ask if the two of them could work together and work out a forgiveness process. I asked him what his reaction had been when this first happened. He said his first reaction was the same as his lawyer's. They both felt there must be some kind of ulterior motive. Michael said he was scared to death. He didn't know what Zelinda had in her mind. There was some fear in his mind that maybe she was out to get revenge and even shoot him. Their first meeting was awkward and somewhat tense. There were long silences because no one knew for sure what to say. But somehow they got through it. Then Zelinda began visiting Michael every week, and as she did so, she began letting go of the old images she had of him. She began to see Michael in the present without the shadow of the past. As she talked about this change, I couldn't help but think about the many, many ways our egos make it so difficult for us to forgive. There are two things our egos wants us to believe and will do everything in their power to convince us are true. The first is that there are some people in this world who do unforgivable things and deserve our hatred for the rest of our lives, even after they're dead. The second is that if you do forgive, you will only get hurt again. Our egos want us to keep our anger hot and alive, not trusting, always on guard against the possibility of getting hurt again. They would have us believe that the past only repeats itself, and that it's impossible to be truly peaceful in the present. Zelinda, after years and years of agony and resentment, wasn't sure that she was capable of forgiving. But she was willing, and that's the key word. She did have a willingness to forgive. And she kept giving her negative thoughts to her inner teacher within her heart to be transformed into love. She spoke about it as I sat there with her and Michael. Zelinda went on to say to me, "After going through this process with Michael, I've learned a lot. I was so filled with anger and pain, I never gave any time to think about how people in prison feel. I never gave time to think that they are also caring, sensitive, and vulnerable people. Not only have I been able to see Michael differently, but I realize that there are many people in prison who could benefit from attitudinal healing and learn to share their feelings in an honest and open way. Michael and I have shared a lot of our inner selves with each other, and we've learned to trust and to love each other." As Zelinda was talking, she and Michael were holding hands, and tears were running down their cheeks. I was in tears too as I watched Zelinda, a mother whose son had been murdered, looking only with tenderness and love into the eyes of the man who had committed that murder. There was a simplicity and a purity in what I witnessed that day. I could not detect even a hint of animosity or hate or anger. Here we were, inside a state prison, and the room was filled with peace and light and tranquility. It is a picture that I will always have in my heart, a picture that I will never forget. That night I had dinner with Zelinda at the home of a mutual friend. During dinner, our host remarked that Zelinda had been able to forgive Michael because she was an extraordinary person. I simply had to interrupt him, and I said, No, that's not it. That's the beauty of her story. I believe with all of my heart that Zelinda is an ordinary person. The important thing is that what she did was extraordinary. And I think that is what gives me hope, that maybe you and I and everyone can do what she did. For many years of my life, I had thought that total forgiveness could be applied by only a few very extraordinary people. In the world I saw, I thought it was not only impossible, but also unsafe to forgive your enemies. Now, I had proof that there's truly another way of seeing this world. Zelinda remains one of the strongest teachers of forgiveness that I'd ever met. Zelinda later moved to Tiburon, California, and she now holds the position assistant to the director at our Center of Attitudinal Healing in Tiburon, California. And Zelinda continues to be a very powerful light and a teacher of forgiveness to everyone who meets her. Henry Landreth is a man you may have never heard of before, but he's an extraordinary teacher for me and has become a very dear and treasured friend. He's shown me that by helping others, we can let go of the past and all the grievances that go with it. And although he faced challenges and situations that most of us wouldn't dream of in our worst nightmares, Henry never gave up. His story is living proof that nothing's impossible, and that there is a solution to any problem through love. I first met Henry in Florida in 1988 when I was giving a lecture there. I was immediately drawn to him. Our friendship began with a feeling that we had known each other all of our lives, almost as if we were long-lost brothers coming together again. It was the beginning of a warm and intimate relationship. At the time we met, Henry was 61 years old. He was born of Jewish parents in Antwerp, Belgium, on March 7th, 1927. Henry is a handsome man with a wonderful smile, and as I sat talking with him, I would have never guessed that he had suffered the hardship, fear, anguish, and loss that he would tell me about. Yet sadly, he had. The early years of his life are not pleasant to hear about. When he was still a child, Henry became a prisoner at Auschwitz and at several other Nazi concentration camps. I was horrified as Henry described the horrendous atrocities he had seen there. The anger and the pain I felt was almost too much to bear. I didn't want to believe that human beings were capable of inflicting such cruelty upon one another. And if I was feeling some intense emotions, I could only wonder at what Henry must have felt at the time those things occurred. It's always been very difficult for me to imagine how anyone could go through the experience of being a prisoner in a concentration camp and then go on with his life to become a successful, caring, trusting, and loving person. And yet that's exactly what Henry's done since those terrible years when he was a prisoner of the Nazis. In 1940, when Henry was 13 years old, his family moved from Belgium to Poland, which was his father's native country. At the time, his father was a men's clothing salesman, and they lived a very comfortable life. In recalling those years, Henry describes many memories of a close and caring family. I had a wonderful mother and father, he told me. There was a lot of closeness, a lot of love in our family. Henry also had a twin sister, Margaret, and as is often the case with twins, they were bonded in a very special way. It was the strength of this bond that later served as a source of a powerful determination to search for her after the war. Henry told me that one day his father came home from work and announced that the Germans were coming to occupy Poland. He told his family that their lives were in danger, that they must escape from Europe to save themselves. He had found a way to get out of Europe by going through Russia and then on to China. But his mother said as long as she had her bed, her family were going to stay together. Soon after the Germans arrived, Henry's father was arrested. His family never saw him again, nor did they learn what had happened to him until many years later, when Henry discovered that his father had been shot and killed only a short time after his arrest. A few months after his father was taken, Henry was picked up and sent to the concentration camp at Auschwitz. He was a very strong boy, about 14 years old at that time, and the Germans valued that strength because it meant that he would be able to work. As Henry told me that part of his story, I couldn't help but recall my own life during those same years. While I was entering high school in Long Beach, California, Henry was entering the insane world where childhood and adolescence and life itself abruptly disappeared. Henry was not alone. Thousands of other children were sent to camps, many of them much younger than he was. They suddenly found themselves in a world where everything they had ever known about trust and faith and love was being challenged as it had never been challenged before. As we went on with the interview, Henry paused many times, telling me that he simply could not find the words to describe the conditions in the camps. Here is part of what he said to me. Many things I don't remember, but I do remember the smell of the crematoriums at night. I remember the beatings and the hangings and the people dying of hunger and the disease all around me. The biggest problem was the terrible hunger and the thirst. Being hungry is one of the worst feelings that a human being can have. From Auschwitz, Henry was taken to another camp, which he said was even worse. It was an underground camp where the prisoners worked in a factory producing anti-aircraft guns. There were about 2,000 prisoners in all, and every day the Nazis made them run 10 miles with hardly any clothes on at all. Henry said they were tortured in many ways. I remember that he stopped speaking for a moment then. He didn't describe the ways in which he and his fellow inmates were tortured. I had the feeling that this was a subject that he just couldn't discuss with me. And after a few seconds, he continued with the story. From the camp where we produced anti-aircraft guns, we were sent to another one, called Guschen II, which was even worse. Then I was taken to an underground camp close to Dresden, Germany. I had no idea where I was because all the time I was there I did not see light, the sun, or anything outside the prison at all. Many prisoners died of typhoid. Sometimes prisoners who were not sick took the leftover food rations of those who were very ill, even though they knew they'd probably get typhoid if they ate the food. They ate it anyway, just for the sake of feeling full for once. Toward the end of the war, an underground movement developed in the camp. One day, some men who were involved in it asked Henry to purposely make a mistake that would sabotage the anti-aircraft weapons he was being forced to work on. The plan was that after doing this, Henry would eat some of the typhus-infected foods. The Germans would then send him to the hospital, where he would be rescued by people from the underground. Henry agreed to do this. He explained to me that the only time prisoners were sent to the hospital was in the very last hours of their lives. So after making that mistake on the production line, he ate the typhoid-infected food and quickly became very sick. He started running a fever that was so high he felt as if he were in a trance. He was taken to the hospital so ill that he didn't know where he was or what he was doing. In the middle of the night, someone came in and gave him something to drink. The next morning when he awoke, Henry found himself surrounded by dead people. He was the only person alive in that room. Somehow he had survived, only to be returned to prison camp. Henry said that after that, he was never completely normal. Many of his friends had died, and he was now encouraging everyone who was still alive to run away. "Come, let's run away," he'd tell them. "Why should they just kill us? We might as well get killed running." The Russian and American troops were closing in, and since they knew the camp was a munitions factory, it became a target. Both prisoners and German soldiers died during the artillery shelling, until finally, with only 300 of the original 3,000 prisoners still alive, the Germans decided to evacuate. The soldiers marched the prisoners for 2 days until they came to a large barn. Henry was still urging the other prisoners to try to escape. A German soldier overheard him and hit him over the head with the butt of his rifle. Covered with blood, Henry burrowed into a pile of straw and lost consciousness. When he woke up, all the other prisoners were gone. The Germans had left him for dead, but he was soon recaptured and taken still yet to another prison. Henry remembered this one too. He stated, "It was a terrible place. Rats and mice were all over. I was hoping at the time that death would come to me because I couldn't stand it anymore." After a few days, I was taken out of the prison to a place outside this little town. I don't know where it was. There were many soldiers, and there were 2 other prisoners beside me. I understood and spoke German, and one of the soldiers said to me, "We have orders to kill you, but the war is almost over. Line up facing the woods, and when we pick up our guns, you start running." This was a true miracle because the soldiers who had given orders to shoot us let us get away. I traveled on foot for many weeks, sleeping in churches and attics, and stealing food to eat. My feet became infected with gangrene. I was in terrible pain. I was scared to go to the doctor because I was afraid I would be recaptured and killed. I wasn't really normal. I was aware of my fear. It was as though I had absolutely none. I was in a crazy state. I ended up in a town in Czechoslovakia where I found a deserted house to sleep in. A woman found me there and told me the war was over. She asked me where I was going. I remembered that I said to the woman, "I can't stop. The war isn't over." This woman eventually convinced Henry that it was safe to come across the street to her home. Once inside, she turned on the radio so that he could hear for himself that the war had actually ended. The woman and her husband let Henry stay with him, and together they nursed him back to health. When he was feeling somewhat better, he left the couple and went to Krakow, Poland, to try and find out about his family. There was a center there for former prisoners of war, where they were given food and where they exchanged information and what had happened to their families and friends. Henry was given a job in a dentist's office. Every day during his lunch hour, he would go to the center to exchange news with other ex-prisoners. One day on the trolley car, he saw a woman who looked familiar to him, but he couldn't remember her name or where he had seen her before. When she got off at the next stop, he followed her. He called out to her, asking her to wait, but the woman kept on walking. "I want to know who you are," Henry cried out. The woman called back and said that if he didn't stop following her, she'd call the police. Henry begged her to tell him who she was, but the woman refused and insisted that he leave her alone. Without knowing why, Henry called out his mother's name. The woman suddenly stopped in her tracks. She turned around and let Henry catch up to her, and they stood there talking for a long time. The woman's name was Mrs. Zawaska, and she had been Henry's mother's best friend before the Germans occupied Poland. The next day, a chauffeured limousine arrived at the dentist's office where Henry worked. The driver informed him that Mr. and Mrs. Zawisko wanted him to come to their house and stay with them. Henry went, and when the Zawiskos realized how sick he was, they saw to it that he received the best of medical care. As his health improved, Henry became aware of the fact that he didn't even know how to eat at the table anymore. His 4 years in the prison camps had even robbed him of his sense of manners. When Henry finally recovered his health, he set out again to find any surviving members of his family. He discovered that his mother had been put aboard a ship with 2,000 other women just a few weeks before the war ended. The ship was sent out to sea and deliberately blown up. Everyone aboard was killed. Henry was grief-stricken at the news. But he had also learned that his sister might be living with several other women in a little town in Germany. He set out on foot to find her, walking and hitchhiking across hundreds of miles. Here is how he described what happened. "One morning, I ended up in a small town where I had been told I might find my sister. I asked everyone I met if they knew anything about her. Finally, I met someone who said there was such a woman, and he told me how to find the house where she lived." Henry described how wonderful his reunion was with his sister, and how overjoyed he was at being with her again. He couldn't remember a time when he had been so happy. He told me that it was surely a miracle. Henry and his sister decided to go to the United States, but there were long delays in getting proper papers. During that time, his sister married and became pregnant. Henry, his sister, and her husband went to Belgium, where the baby was born. While he was in Belgium, Henry learned how to be a diamond cutter. Then in 1950, he immigrated to the United States, arriving with only $20 to his name. At first, he worked as a diamond cutter, but only a short time later, after coming here, he was drafted into the Army. He served 2 years in Korea, after which he went to New York City to study hotel management. He was married in 1954 and went to Florida on his honeymoon. He and his wife liked it so very much that they stayed there, and that is where he lives today. Henry told me that after he moved to Florida, things started to turn around for him in a big way. He became a manager of a luxury hotel, and later a manager for Holiday Inn hotels. And in 1969, he received a franchise for a Holiday Inn at Disney World. I want to emphasize that Henry has chosen not to go through life embittered by the horrendous experiences of his early years. Instead, he has chosen to see himself as living on borrowed time which he sees as very precious. He chose not to live a life in which he was constantly reliving the past, but to do his best to live in the present. He is now living a life of deep gratitude, believing that his purpose is to embrace the world to make it a better place and to demonstrate how one person can make a difference giving to others who are in need. Giving has become a way of life to Henry, a way of saying thank you to God for life. Although Henry had become very successful financially, he still wasn't happy inside, and he began to ask the universe what could he do to be helpful. And the message he received was to help children who were coming close to dying. He had had this experience as a child himself. He started bringing families of children who had catastrophic illness to his own hotel and had made arrangements for them to go to all the things at Disneyland free. But after about 3 years of his own hotel doing this and other hotels, there were just so many families that were in need, he decided to start a whole new organization called Give Kids the World. And he created a very wonderful village that the Holiday Inn and many other people have contributed to. Today, over 2,400 families come to Give Kids the World Village. They come at a time when their families are in their worst despair. Thousands of letters come into Henry and the staff at Give Kids the World, describing the wonderful experience that these children have at a time when they're feeling depressed and oftentimes in great pain. Henry has many prominent people on his board, people like the astronauts, Walter Cronkite, Arthur Buchwald. Many people now are asking Henry if he could start a similar village in France at the Disney World that will be there. Henry has found his way home by focusing his entire life with these children. He stopped all his active business enterprises and is spending his full time being at the village, being with these children and their families. Henry is a remarkable example of the principle that nothing's impossible. Yet with everything he's been through and with everything he's done for others, he's also become a teacher of humility. I can't begin to tell you the many different ways that Henry has given to others without others ever knowing about it. In 1989, in recognition of his contributions to humanity, many of which will never be made public, Henry was chosen as one of the 12 most caring individuals in the United States by the Institute of Caring in Washington, D.C. From the depths of his being, Henry views giving as an important part of his own healing, and he's experiencing a sense of joy and peace that he had never really experienced before. I noticed that Henry had mentioned the word miracles several times when he told me his story, so I asked him if he thought miracles had something to do with God, and here's what he said. Well, Jerry, I believe there's a God. I don't know what that is, but I believe in God and I believe in faith. In my own thinking, what has happened to me is what I call faith. It is meant for me to be here. It is meant for me to do these things. Finally, I asked him this. If after you died, you could have one sentence on your tombstone to tell about your life, what would that sentence be? I thought that his answer summed up perfectly his attitude of forgiveness and his loving, caring spirit. Henry said that he would like his epitaph to say that he did his very best to bring peace and love into this world. Whenever people tell me that they would like to find a way to do something helpful and meaningful in the world, I immediately think of Ruth Brinker, a woman who found her own way to be helpful by tuning into the needs of people around her. She's a wonderful reminder to me and to all of us that perhaps the first step toward being helpful to others is to slow down, look beyond ourselves, and give our full attention to what is going around us. Ruth is the founder and director of a San Francisco project called Open Hands, which helps to feed AIDS patients who are too ill to leave their homes. One of the first questions I asked Ruth was what motivated her to start this project. And here's Ruth's story. In 1984, a young friend of hers became sick with AIDS. She was appalled at how quickly his illness progressed. He went downhill so rapidly that he was soon unable to take care of himself. Along with some friends, she formed a sort of caretaker group. They would take turns dropping in to visit and bringing meals for him. Ruth soon realized that there had to be many people throughout the city who were in the same condition, but who did not have a support system like this. She knew that the number of people suffering from AIDS was increasing. She felt that many of them were really dying of malnutrition because they didn't have the energy to go to the grocery store and they had no one else to bring them food. So she started Open Hands. Like many wonderful projects that end up helping a great many people, Open Hands started very small. Ruth went on to tell me her story. She stated, "Initially there was just me. Then very shortly I began to gather volunteers. By the end of 1986, we were serving 100 people a day, 2 meals per day for each person. We served a hot dinner entree and a bag lunch for the following day. Our volunteers would pick up the lunches and deliver them to the AIDS patients' homes. From the very beginning, I was determined to provide only very good food. We never used anything but fresh vegetables and never any processed food of any kind. At first, I wanted to use fancy foods, but I quickly learned that when you are ill, you want simple foods, the kind of foods that Mother used to make. So I switched over to pot roasts, meatloafs, mashed potatoes, and that kind of thing. We received a lot of favorable publicity in 1987 and 1988. I received San Francisco's KRON Television's award for those who care. I also received the Dorothy Langston Humanitarian Award. Every time I received publicity for an award, it would result in contributions from the public, and our client list would then grow some more. So by the beginning of 1988, we were serving 350 people, 700 meals a day. By 1989, we were serving over 500 people, 1,000 meals a day. And we now have over 400 volunteers who deliver the food in their own cars. From a kitchen of about 500 square feet, we now have one that's almost 4,000 square feet. It's really a state-of-the-art kitchen with the very best equipment. When I remarked that it seemed as if this kind of program was needed in every city, Ruth told me that they already helped starting an Open Hands in Chicago and Atlanta, and that they were assisting similar groups that already existed in New York City and Dallas. She plans to expand her own program in San Francisco to help drug users in the area. She also hopes to begin offering food to child daycare centers, charging a fee and dropping off meals at centers, so that when the parents pick up their children in the evening, they can pick up meals at the same time. This will free them to spend more time with their children rather than spending the time in grocery shopping, preparing meals, and cleaning up afterwards. As Ruth told me the story of Open Hands, I began to think how very creative she was. She doesn't depend on the government for any of the financing of Open Hands. She clearly knows that when there is a will to help others, there is a creative love force in the universe that will help us find a way. What a beautiful and original way to be of service to everyone, from AIDS patients to working parents. I wanted to know more about what was behind a person like this, a person who would dedicate herself to making such a difference in her community. So I asked her what motivated her to do what she's been doing. And she replied, "I had a deep inner need to do it. I had a vision of people all over San Francisco who were too weak to take care of themselves. I also had visions of my friend who died of AIDS, multiplied hundreds of times over, and I felt I needed to do something about it. For as long as I can remember, I felt that if someone who was in trouble crossed my path, I had an obligation to help them as much as I could." As I thought about her answer, I remembered many of the famous people who had similar visions of life down through the years, and I wondered if Ruth had been influenced by any of them. I asked her if she had any particular role models, or if there were any people who were her teachers or whose lives influenced her. She said that one person who had influenced her was Aldous Huxley's teacher, Swami Prabhavananda of the Vedanta Society in Southern California. Ruth told me that she was raised in the Midwest, where if you were not in the Judeo-Christian classification, it was thought that you must have been involved in superstitions. Therefore, anything from the Far East was considered paganism and not given any credibility at all. But she thought it was very curious that someone as brilliant as Aldous Huxley should be influenced by a man from India. So she decided that the next time she was in Southern California, she'd try to meet him. She heard Swami Prabhavananda speak 2 or 3 times, and she said she was never so impressed by anyone in her life. He spoke simply and quoted the Bible, and to Ruth, his interpretations of the good book seemed to make more sense than the one she'd heard before. I asked her if she could tell me a little more about this spiritual experience that changed her life. And she went on to say, "It's going to sound strange, but at one point he said that anyone could experience God in about 3 minutes. He said that if we would simply quiet our minds, wipe out all of our thoughts, we would feel something, and that something would be the beginning of a relationship with God. So I did it. It was much more difficult than I thought it would be, but I found that by concentrating very intensely, I could do it. I was in my apartment, and I took my phone off the hook and buried it under the pillows before I began. Soon I was flooded with this wonderful calm and loving euphoria. I was young then and very busy, so when I put the phone back on the hook, it rang. I had a lot of distractions then, and in those days I turned to God only when I was deeply troubled. Then one day I had a problem, and I was sobbing on my bed. I suddenly realized that I was indulging in self-pity, and I decided to quiet my mind and go into a meditative state. I was immediately filled with a wonderful calm and euphoria, and it was at that point that I began practicing it on a regular basis, and I have never experienced that kind of unhappiness again. Ruth says that there's a part of her mind that keeps that calm and euphoric feeling while she goes about doing whatever needs to be done. As she puts it, she feels she has the connection to God all the time. I always find it frustrating to find exactly the right words to describe other people, but in Ruth's case, I'll try to do it by saying that there is a light that reflects from her eyes, and that the essence of her being lights up the room. There's a sense of peace about her that's contagious. You don't have to hear her words to be able to feel her peace and love. Being with her is like being covered with a blanket of love. I was most impressed by her complete commitment to doing what she sees as God's work, and her belief that nothing's impossible. Ruth makes it clear that it's not so much your profession or social status in life that counts, but what you do to make this world a better place. She is so very clear about her connection to God and her belief that she is just an instrument of His will. But it's her simplicity that's most endearing to me. It reminds all of us that the way of loving, giving, and happiness is not complicated, but very simple indeed. All it takes is complete trust and faith. Wally Amos is a wonderful teacher, a wonderful man, and a good friend. He's someone who gives people hope that nothing's impossible and that each of us can make a difference. He teaches that when you believe in yourself totally and are totally committed to helping others, everything becomes possible. He's a true teacher of joy. In the beginning of his life, Wally faced many hardships and challenges. Yet, he's been able to transform those experiences into positive lessons which helped him make the success that he is today. Wally's better known as Famous Amos, the creator of the world-renowned company and products that bear his name, Famous Amos chocolate chip cookies. And because he came from a poor and rather dismal background, he speaks with authority to the many people from similar backgrounds who see him as a role model. Shortly after I got to know him, Wally became interested in the work we do at our Center for Attitudinal Healing in Tiburon, California. He has given generously of his time, talking with children who have catastrophic illnesses through our telephone support network. Every time that I've asked him to phone some child or visit some family, he's been quick to respond. And of course, he always sends them his calling card, his famous chocolate chip cookies. He also maintains his friendship with these children and their families, and he often does so for many years. For example, 8 years ago, I put him in touch with a 12-year-old child named Carrie, who had sickle cell anemia and had come close to dying more than once. Wally not only called him then, but he still visits him every time he goes to Atlanta. Carrie is now 19 and is a pre-med student who wants to become a pediatrician. If ever there was a man out to make people happy, to put a smile on their faces, to reach out a helping hand, and to commit himself to being directed by God, that man is Wally Amos. He works as hard and consistently as anyone I know to help others as part of his own spiritual path. In his office, there is a sign on the wall that I'll never forget. It reads, "A volunteer is someone who reaches their hand into the darkness to help another hand out into the light, only to discover it's their own." It reminds me that to give is to receive. By helping others, we help ourselves. These are truths that Wally demonstrates every day. I first met Wally Amos when I was giving a lecture in Hawaii at the Unity Church in Diamond Head in 1979. I had brought some of the children with me from our Attitudinal Healing Center in Tiburon, children who were suffering from life-threatening illnesses. Wally and his wife were in the audience, and they came up afterwards to introduce themselves. Not only did they thank me for the lecture, but they offered free chocolate chip cookies for our annual picnic. A few weeks later, after we returned to California, we received several cartons of cookies. To me, it was like receiving cartons of gold. Like many people, I've been addicted to Wally's chocolate chip cookies for years, so it was a delight to meet him and his wife, Christine. Little did I realize that we would become the closest of friends. Since that first meeting, I don't think a week has gone by without our talking on the phone. Wally is the national spokesperson for Literary Volunteers of America, and he devotes much of his time to helping create opportunities for people to learn to read and write. He's had many awards and honors bestowed upon him, not the least of which was the Horatio Alger Award. He received an honorary doctorate in education from Johnson and Wales University, the President's Award for Entrepreneurial Excellence, and many, many others. Wally's now 53 years old. In our interview, the first thing I asked about him was his early life, and here's the way he described it to me. "My mom was a domestic and my dad a common laborer. Dad wasn't around much, and Mom was pretty tough. She was a disciplinarian. She would hit you with anything, switches, extension cords, whatever. My folks were divorced when I was about 12 years old. My mom then went to Orlando, Florida to live with her sister and her mom, and I moved to New York City to live with her other sister, Aunt Della. A year later, my mom came to New York, and I started living with her again and with my grandmother, Julia. In New York, I delivered papers, worked on an ice truck, and in a dairy, and in a supermarket. I was never really a bad kid, but my mother had me toe such a line that if I went either to the left or the right of it, that was enough for her to beat me. When I was a kid growing up in Florida, she would sometimes beat me until there were welts on my back and on my bottom. But you know, I've worked through a lot of that. I told her some years ago, "Ruby, if you were raising me today, I'd have you arrested for child abuse." As a kid, I didn't question her authority. From the time I was a baby, that was the way she raised me, and I accepted that. But now I know that it had an effect on our relationship for a long time. It also had an effect on my relationships with everyone else, especially the other females I came in contact with. Because I wasn't raised in a loving environment, and because I was unable to express myself, I couldn't share love with anyone because it had never been shared with me. I had to really look at that and work hard through a lot of forgiveness. I had to realize that my mother was just doing what she had been taught. Her mother had beat up on her too. Wally attended church frequently as a child, but as he grew older, he moved away from religion and the church. He says that it wasn't until many years later that he began to experience God in a totally different way. That was in 1976, when he started going to the Unity Church in Hawaii. In the intervening years, Wally said that he was pretty self-centered and me-oriented, and that he was about as controlling and manipulative as a person could be. He didn't realize at the time, he said, but he really felt unlovable, afraid of love, and fearful of God. It's no wonder that Wally and thousands of other men and women with similar backgrounds have found it so difficult to experience love. Never having experienced it as children, they feel unlovable as adults. For many years, it seemed to Wally that women were dangerous enemies. Much of this was owing to the fact that he had not really completed his unfinished business in terms of his feelings towards his own parents. A short time after joining the Unity Church, Wally met Christine. He said that these two events, joining the church and meeting his wife-to-be, were certainly the most meaningful of his life. They were turning points. I asked Wally to tell me what happened after he left home. He said that he dropped out of high school to join the Air Force. After that, he worked at Saks Fifth Avenue, and then worked for the fire department. Later on, he worked for the William Morris Agency, which at that time was looking for a black trainee. Here's the rest of his story as he told it to me. I first got married in 1958 to Maria. My sons Michael and Gregory came out of that marriage. We divorced in 1962. As I look back, I can see I was very selfish and egotistical. Everything had to be the way I wanted it to be. I fooled around a lot. I was not very loving, and I didn't have a clue about how to really love. My second marriage to Shirley was in 1967. There were a number of separations and then a divorce 5 years later. My son Sean was born during that marriage. Even after all that, I continued to have trouble with personal relationships. I never wanted to give a part of me to any relationship, at least not until I met my present wife, Christine. That's when I began to see that there was someone who really, really loved me. How many people can say that in a lifetime? We now have Sarah, who is now 7 years old. Wally told me that his wife Christine has helped him change his life, and that she's been a mirror to him. What does he mean by a mirror? Here is how he explained it. I believe that being a mirror is what all relationships are for. Life is really never about the other person. We see something in the other person and we say, I don't like that. But it's really about ourselves. It's about us. Christine has reflected parts of me that I didn't like. They were showing up in her, and it bounced right back to me. It made me really take a hard look at who I was and how I was feeling about life. I began to see the love she gives me, and I began to accept it. Before Christine, I don't think I was worthy of love, because I never had anyone love me in such a way. Right here, Wally is reminding us of how our egos work, and how easy it is to blame others and not to take responsibility for our own thoughts and actions. I've seen how hard Wally works at reminding himself that everything he perceives is but a mirror of his own thoughts, and he's taken responsibility for his own thoughts and his own actions, rather than blaming others. It's a lesson we would all do well to learn. When we take responsibility for our own thoughts and experiences, the world looks different. Then, when we find ourselves in conflict, instead of taking the useless path of trying to change others, we can learn to change ourselves, to change our own thoughts and attitudes. Of course, no story about Wally would be complete without telling how he became Famous Amos. he started baking chocolate chip cookies for his friends back in 1970, making them like his Aunt Dell had taught him to do. People started telling him that they were so good he should go into business and sell them. At that time, however, Wally's main ambition was to become a big-time show business manager. Then one night, a friend of his said that she had a friend who could put up the money to get a business started baking and selling his cookies. Well, that fell through, but got Wally thinking. Maybe he should go into business. He managed to get some friends, Jeff Wall, Helen Reddy, and Marvin Gaye, to put up the money, and he put up everything else. Wally told me that he knew it was a great idea and that he knew it would be a great success. He was going to open up one store on Sunset Boulevard just to make a living. And on March 10, 1975, they opened up the first store in the world that sold only chocolate chip cookies. It was immediately a big hit. And did Wally's cookie business ever grow? I found sacks of his chocolate chip cookies with Wally's wonderful face staring out at me in stores, hotels. Sometimes it seems everywhere I look. Even Tokyo now has a famous Amos chocolate chip cookie store. Today you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who hasn't tasted his cookies. Wally put all of himself into that business, even going so far as to personally handle the public relationships for his company. Today, Wally is no longer in the cookie business, but he has a lot of irons in the fire, writing books, giving lectures, and even doing a television pilot show that he's trying to sell. He still does a lot of traveling, but his home remains in Hawaii, where he's just a few blocks from the beach. Recently, he wrote what you might call a purpose statement for himself, and I thought it so powerful, I'd like to share it with you now. Here's what he wrote. My purpose for living is to be a servant of God, assisting him in his work to help people realize their inner strength and greatness, to help them know they are not victims being manipulated by outside forces, to be a guide leading them to God within, thereby having them discover their true power and nature, which is love. I shall perform this assignment first and foremost by being a loving, positive example in all my thoughts and words and deeds, and by endeavoring at all times to be an open channel for God's guidance. My primary means of communicating God's message shall be writing books, recording audio and video cassettes, lecturing and appearing on television and through motion pictures. I will also share with others any materials that might get them closer to God. I shall constantly listen for God's guidance as to whether I shall provide my services for a fee or free of charge, as I acknowledge that God is the source of all good in my life. Thank you, Father, for every opportunity to serve. There is little I can add to that except to say that I am a witness to the fact that the way Wally lives his life is consistent with his statement of purpose. For a long time, I've believed that each of us have many facets to his personality. To draw an analogy, the personality is a lot like a house with 1,000 windows. And what others see in us may seem to change, depending on which of our windows they choose to look through. When I think about this, I can't help but reflect on how frequently I've judged another person's entire personality by only one single window. One of the many lessons Ted Turner taught me is not to be distracted by the negative aspects of other people's personality, but to look more clearly at the positive ones. When you're a famous person, people who don't know you well tend to fix their attention on the personality facets that are highlighted in the media. They ignore all the other parts, even though that there may be hundreds of them. This is more or less what I had done in regards to Ted Turner. Before I met him, I had read and heard quite a number of different stories about him. What impressed me the most were the stories about his commitment to the environment, to peace, and to the many different ways in which he had made a contribution to these causes. What impressed me the least were the stories that depicted him as a man who walked over other people, who was overly absorbed in himself, and who would figuratively eat people up with his anger. I have to admit that based on these media stories, I had made unflattering judgments about him. I think that very few people who ever meet Ted Turner come away with neutral feelings about him. They like him and admire him, or they despise him. There just doesn't seem to be any gray area. In some people's eyes, he's a Don Juan type. Others claim that he's a person with a temper that's hard to control. To other people, he seems to be a person who is difficult to be around. The force of his energy seems to raise storms of confusion or controversy wherever he goes. That last characteristic is one that I know only too well, because in the past, many people had described me in the very same way. So even though everything I knew about Ted Turner was hearsay, I fell into the trap of making judgments about him. I think that sometimes we see in others things that we don't like in ourselves. I realized that I was doing that with Ted, projecting onto him the things I didn't like about myself. Now, at this point, you may be wondering why I decided to interview Ted Turner at all, seeing as how I had such mixed feelings about him. The reason is that he demonstrates in a very powerful way how one person can make a difference. The many-windowed house of Ted's personality offered many choices and many possibilities to get sidetracked by any one of them. In this case, I've chosen to tell a little of his story by looking at him through the window of his heart. Before I tell you about my interview with Ted, let me tell you something about his accomplishments. In 1970, he purchased Channel 17, an independent UHF television station in Atlanta. In 1976, he originated the superstation concept, transmitting the station's signal to cable systems across the country via satellite. In the same year, he purchased the Atlanta Braves baseball team. And in 1977, he bought the Atlanta Hawks basketball team. On June 1st, 1980, Ted launched CNN, the world's first live, in-depth, round-the-clock, all-news television network. I invite you now to imagine that you are with us at Big Sur on March 12, 1989, high on the rocky coastline overlooking the Pacific, where Ted and I and our mutual friend J.J. Ebow have come to spend the day. It's a small home with a large living room which has huge windows looking out over one of the most spectacular views I've ever seen. What I liked best was the pathway that led to the top of the cliff, where there was a bench looking out over the blue Pacific. It was a clear, warm day, and just being there felt like being in heaven. Before we had breakfast, Ted remembered that he'd forgotten to get some groceries. As we drove down the hill in his Jeep, he suddenly put on the brakes, stopped, and jumped out. He picked up an empty beer can that someone had tossed out on the road and put it in a trash container in the back of his Jeep. Only then did he continue driving down the hill to the market. That single event told me more about Ted Turner than 1,000 words could have done. It told me that here was a man who wasn't just talking about the environment. Here was a man who was doing something about it, even in the simplest ways, like picking up trash someone had left behind. In that single gesture, I recognized a consistency between what Ted Turner thought and what he did. I had, and still have, tremendous respect for that. Later, back in the house overlooking the ocean, I asked Ted what kind of advice he might give to an 18-year-old who was just about to go out into the world on his own. Ted said that it's important to do good in order to make the world a little better and kinder and more thoughtful and a caring place. He added that he thought there was a Helen Keller just about in every one of us. Next, I asked Ted to tell me something about his early life. He said he'd always loved the outdoors and loved animals, and have been happy doing anything that involved wildlife and nature. As a young child, he went to a very religious Presbyterian school where evangelicals came in and preached about salvation and damnation. He told me he was very taken in by it. Then he continued to tell me more about his formative years. He went on to say, "I was in military school from the time I was 11 until I was 17, when I began to wonder about religion. My sister got sick with lupus when I was 15, and I did a lot of praying to help her get well, but none of it did any good. Good Christians are not supposed to worry about not getting their prayers answered. You're not supposed to lose your faith when something awful happens to someone you love, but sometimes it does happen that way. My sister was 3 years younger than I. She was a real sweet little girl who became sick when she was 12. She was ill for about 5 years before she passed away, and the disease destroyed her mind and kept her from growing. She was just terribly sick all the time, in tremendous pain. It was so heart-wrenching for us all that it just about destroyed my family. My parents eventually got divorced. My mother is running around trying to find miracle cures all over the world, and there were none. Even today, 30 years later, they still have no cure for lupus. All of this really shook my religious faith. I was curious about what Ted's spiritual and religious beliefs were today. I asked him if he had become an atheist after the death of his sister, and Ted replied, "Well, I don't know if atheist is the right word. I have my own beliefs, but I kind of like to keep them to myself. I don't ask people what their religious beliefs are. I don't like labels. I've got my beliefs, and they're private." It was clear that Ted didn't want to say more about it, so I changed the subject. We began to talk some more about his upbringing, and he told me that his father had the greatest influence on his life of any single person. He said his father was basically a kind man, but that he was a tough disciplinarian, and that his ideas were very strong ones. He was in the old school, and he felt very strongly about the things he believed in. It was pretty hard to change his mind about anything. But Ted said that his father taught him a very strong sense of honor. He was also big on good, old-fashioned, hard work, and he believed that if a young person had it tough growing up, it would be easier on him when he grew older. The child would have learned how to handle adversity and hard work and how to be independent. That was one of the reasons Ted's father had sent him to military school, so he would learn to be strong and independent. Although Ted had mentioned his parents' divorce, he hadn't gone into details, and I felt that it was painful for him to talk about personal relationships, so I just didn't feel it was appropriate for me to press him any more about his earlier years. Although a lot of things had been left unsaid, I did have the feeling that there was a great potential for fear and bitterness and lack of trust. His sister's death, a strict upbringing that didn't have very much in the way of expressing tenderness, and his being shipped off to military school, all contained the seeds for those kinds of grievances against his father, and by extension against life and people in general. But although Ted could have allowed those bitter feelings to seep into every part of his life, he seemed satisfied to identify with what he saw as his father's most positive traits. Specifically, he learned the discipline of believing in yourself 100%, of believing that nothing's impossible, and of not letting other people's belief deter you from your goal. I remembered a story I had heard about Ted firing someone who he learned had been disloyal to him. I began to wonder how Ted let go of old grievances with people who had wronged him in business, or anywhere else for that matter, so I asked him how he deals with those sorts of things. And Ted said, "It's hard to forgive when someone you trust stabs you in the back or embezzles funds or something like that. The legal phrase for it is larceny after trust. On the other hand, you expect your competitors to try and best you any way they can. But when someone who's supposed to be on the same team as you betrays you, that's the hardest thing I find to forgive." I then asked Ted about personal relationships. about the importance of taking responsibility for healing relationships in our own lives. I wasn't prepared for him to quote the Bible, but that's exactly what he did. He said, "It says in the Bible that you should forgive your enemies. That is one of the things you've got to do. You have to learn how not to harbor a grudge, how to forgive." Ted reminded me that in order to have inner peace, we need to learn the value of forgiveness. He also talked about what our egos believe, that it's not always easy to forgive those we feel have hurt us. Because of my own experiences with the forgiveness process, I could sympathize with his struggles to let go of grievances. I think this is a lifelong process for all of us. I also believe that if we wish to break the barriers of our self-imposed limitations, it can be very helpful to have models like Ted who've broken those barriers themselves. I believe that in the psychological and spiritual sense, every person who's broken barriers is an ordinary person who is doing extraordinary things. They teach us that we can do the same. Our talk turned to his efforts to improve the environment. And I asked Ted what a person can do to help light the kind of fire and passion that he has. Suddenly, he became very animated and said, "This planet is my home. It's our home." People don't think about it that way. People think about their little house and their little yard and their little town as their home. That was fine 200 years ago, but the world has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. All it takes is a poison spray, and you can kill your whole garden in 10 minutes. Basically, that's what we're doing to the earth. We're wrecking our home. There's a great many people worried about these things, and I'm one of them. We've got to change. Nobody wants to spread poison in their yard. Nobody wants to feed poison food to children or give their families water that isn't fit to drink. Everybody wants clean water and air. Everybody wants a yard free of garbage, but they don't worry about the garbage being in someone else's yard or someone else's water or air being poisoned. Well, there's got to be a change. We have to develop a global ethic, not just a personal ethic. After listening to Ted Turner and getting to know him, I almost had to laugh at myself as I remember my first feelings about him, which were ambivalent to say the least. To be perfectly honest, it was more than just ambivalence. The truth is, I really didn't like him in spite of all the wonderful things I knew he had done. As I look back at it now, I see that my mind was being led by my ego, and I was more concerned with things that Ted had done in the past that were not admirable. What a wonderful sense of freedom it is to know that we don't have to be stuck in the past and know that love is our only reality. It is the only reality we have because only love is eternal. And now I can tell you with absolute sincerity and honesty that I not only like this guy, Ted Turner, but I feel great compassion and love for him. I'm so glad that we are sharing this planet together. On August 9th, 1989, I was fortunate enough to appear as a guest on the Today Show. Also on the program that morning was a man named Frank Morgan, who Bryant Gumbel introduced as the top bebop saxophone player in the world. Listening to him play, I was so moved by his music that I found myself wanting to find out more about him. After meeting him and learning about his turnaround in life, I felt that there was an important message that I wanted to share with others. Both Frank and his wife, Rosalinda, agreed for an interview, and both of them impressed me with their openness and sincerity with which they talked about their struggles. Here's their story. Frank Morgan came from a broken home, and he felt from early on that neither his mother or father had much time for him. He was an only child, and he ended up being raised by his two grandmothers. His father was a musician, a leader of the famous Ink Spots, and he was on the road virtually all the time. Frank's mother traveled along with him. Frank started playing the guitar when he was 3 or 4 years old. It was at that very young age when he first had the opportunity of hearing the man who many think perhaps is the greatest saxophone player ever to live, Charlie Parker. When Parker stood up to play his first solo in that big band, Frank said it was like he was hearing his own voice for the first time. Charlie Parker became his idol, and later his music teacher, although Frank made a point of telling me that he also worked hard to be a classical saxophonist. Charlie Parker was a drug addict at the time, but to Frank that didn't seem like such a big deal. He took it more as a normal way of life, and he seemed to identify with that lifestyle. Frank told me he thinks that, on a subconscious level, he later kind of felt that he had to do drugs to understand what his teacher knew. The lesson there, Frank said, was that I can't hear what you're saying because what you're doing speaks so loud. Frank was raised in Milwaukee and attended a school that was very similar to the Montessori school, a school where you could go at your own pace. He was an excellent student there and was even promoted ahead and skipped a few grades. And then, when he was 14, he moved to California, and things dramatically changed. He went on to tell me, in Milwaukee, it was hip to raise your hand in the classroom and to get good grades. I got to California only to find that it was very unhip to do those things. And then I went to an all-black school where many of the students were street kids. I ended up going to Los Angeles City College and began working as a musician. I was 19 the first time I went to jail. About a fourth of my life has been spent in and out of jail since then. I've been into heroin and cocaine, and I've had a habit for many years. I was never a seller or a pusher, though. I was always just a customer who did petty crimes, burglary and forgery. So I spent a lot of time in jail, but even there, it wasn't that hard to get drugs and continue on with your habit. Next, I asked Rosalinda to tell me about her perceptions of Frank over the 10 years or so that she had known him. She said that there were several times that she had almost gave up on him. She remembered visiting him in 5 different correctional institutions over a period of 5 to 6 years. However, there were occasions during that time when she became so discouraged or angry that she just stopped writing and visiting him. Rosalinda said that there's a lovely light in Frank, and that she always has been able to see that in him. But it was always frustrating trying to get him to let go of the fear and to lean more toward the light in himself. She said that the light has always been there and that Frank is very personable, one of the sweetest people she'd ever met. She added that she and Frank had just celebrated his 4th year of freedom, 4 years since he had last been incarcerated. I asked Frank what happened to make the difference for him, what motivated him to get away from drugs and the life that he was leading, which always ended up with him in prison. Frank went on to tell me, I finally turned it over to God. Rosalinda had told me, you say you love me and you want us to be together. If you really want that, then you have to stop going to prison. You have to play your saxophone and stop abusing yourself. I'm not going to stand by and watch you kill yourself. So I prayed to God to help me stop going back to prison, to help me work better as an artist, and to give me another chance with Rosalinda and with life. And I've gotten everything I've prayed for. When I asked Frank if he thought that it's God's work for him to play the saxophone, he smiled and said yes, and that he believed that was his assignment. He thinks that when he does what God gave him the gift to do, And when he goes out there and uses that gift with humility, the world then unfolds in a harmonious way. He says that there is no other way he can explain what happened to him since he got out of prison the last time. Frank wants to get his life together now, and he especially wants to help kids stay off drugs. He thinks that you teach by being an example, and his goal is to be that example. He put it this way: I'm tired of lying. It's beautiful to get up in the morning now and say, I don't have to lie to anyone today. But I can't be that example to kids until I'm off methadone or until I have no desire to smoke pot or do cocaine. Drugs don't really do it for me anymore. I don't want to feel guilty, and I know the bottom line is that I have to be sober to do what I do. Frank went on to tell me that at the top of his list of people he's not yet totally forgiven was his father, but he added that he was still working on that. During our interview, he said that he knew his father and mother were very proud of what he's doing, and that he's glad he's doing it while they're still alive. Shortly after our interview, Rosalinda and Frank sent me a note saying that Frank's father had passed away. Having gotten to know Frank, I feel certain that he will eventually find that total forgiveness in his heart and the inner peace that comes with it, if it hasn't done so already. Finally, I asked Frank to tell me how he would like people to remember him after he was gone. And he said he'd like to be remembered as a failure who became a success, someone who shared his love for the world through his music. He also would like to be an example for others who have given up hope and think they're doomed to failure for the rest of their lives. He wants them to know from his own experience that it's not impossible to stop taking drugs. You cannot spend time with Frank and Rosalinda without recognizing the light they bring to the world. Although they have been to hell and back, they've chosen to have hope and faith in God, in love, and each other. They are very grateful for the success of their marriage and the success of Frank's career, and for the many blessings they are now receiving. Frank is no longer afraid of failure or success. In his heart, he knows that he's an instrument of God, playing the music that goes right to the center of his soul. He has demonstrated for himself and for many others that there are no limits and that everything is possible when you turn your life over to God. I heard a story once about a man who had worked in middle management all of his life. Then one day, long before he was due to retire, he suddenly had a heart attack and died. Many of the people who had worked with this man came to his funeral. And there at the funeral, they were all struck with a rather chilling realization that this could happen to them too. One of the things that frightened these people was that not only was this man gone, but after a while it was almost as if he had never been there. One question all of them asked was, "When I'm dead, how will I be remembered? Has my life been so insignificant that I really didn't make a difference?" Needless to say, those aren't easy questions. Many of us even avoid asking them because the answers can be painful. For so many of us, the only answers we get feel empty. For example, some of us may be fearful that we will be remembered only because we were successful salesmen, or that we always came to work on time, or that we got a gold watch when we retired, or that we were good at sports. Well, it's my impression that most of us don't give a hoot about being remembered for our punctuality or job performance or how successful we were at earning money. When we live our lives as robots, caught up in the routine and humdrum business of the day, or when we spend most of our lives competing to see who's best or who has the most possessions, we may truly feel that our lives are empty. I believe that what really matters to most of us are the heart connections. That is, the love we extend to each other. That is what really makes our lives matter. Many, many years ago, I remember someone saying that living without sharing one's life is a wasted life, and I believe this is true. As the years pass and we enter that stage of life that some refer to as old age or elderly, there's a temptation to look back on our lives and be disappointed with what we find. And if we look ahead, we see only a few years left, and we may wonder what we've really accomplished. Oftentimes, I think we're struck by the feelings that we've had little or no effect on the planet or those who live on it. How old we are, or how many years we have left to live, are questions that don't have to make us feel that our contributions have been small. When it comes to love, there are no big or small gifts. True love is always total and beyond any measurement or comparison. There are many people who did not learn about giving total love until rather late in their lives. They're late bloomers. The way I look at it, in God's eyes, some flowers bloom early while others bloom late, but all of them blossom and share their beauty and magnificence and love with all who are willing to receive their gifts. You're never too old, or for that matter too young, to make a difference. Let me share with you first the story of one of those late bloomers. His name is Joseph Charles, and he has found a way to touch the hearts of thousands of people every day. I first saw him on San Francisco Bay Area television news, and his story literally made my entire being chuckle and smile with delight. Mr. Charles, when I interviewed him, was a 78-year-old retired man, and the news story I saw showed him doing what he had done for years. He was standing at the curb in front of his house during the morning rush hour, wearing white gloves and like a graceful ballet dancer, waving at all the passengers in the cars going by. He was wearing a smile as wide as the sky, and as the cars went by, he would call out to them, "Have a great day, have a beautiful day, have a happy day." It seems that as people began to learn about him, they started driving as much as a half hour out of their way just to be greeted by him in the morning and to start their day with a smile. Here was a man who was making a heart connection with thousands of people, and he only started this in his later years. I managed to make an appointment with Mr. Charles, and the morning I arrived, I found him standing at the curb in front of his house, white gloves and all, waving at the passers-by. An ABC news team was there from New York, filming him for the evening national news. I noticed that everyone waved back at him as enthusiastically and as energetically as Mr. Charles waved to them. There were all kinds of people, families with small children on their way to school, kids on bikes, truck drivers, commuters, people walking on the sidewalk smiling and laughing, people honking their horns. And there was Mr. Charles waving his arms as if he was dancing and greeting everyone with a "Have a great day, have a happy day." When he wasn't waving, he stood so erect that it seemed as if his head might be touching the clouds, and he looked much younger than his years. As I watched all this, I thought that there was no way that a person could go by Mr. Charles and still feel down or depressed. It was no wonder that so many people drove miles out of their way to see him. It helped them to start their day on an upper. Here was a man who was teaching what so many of us find so difficult, a man who was starting the day with a smile and a heart full of love for everyone. And it was clear that all the love and the positive feelings he was giving to so many was being returned 1,000-fold. Here was a man who demonstrated that to give is to receive. I asked Mr. Charles how long he'd been known as the Waver. He said that it all began in 1962. He went on to tell me, "It all started one day when I was working in my garden, and a neighbor said to me, 'You know that when you wave and smile at me as I go by, it makes me feel so good that I just like to walk by here.' He told me, 'I bet there are a lot of other people who could use your help in starting their day with a smile. Why don't you just go out in the street and wave and smile at people as they go by and help them start their day out right. Well, at first I thought it was a nutty idea and that people would just laugh at me for being a crazy old man. But after a while, something spoke from within my heart, something that just said, do it. It was like God talking to me. So one morning I just began. I was amazed at the response. People not only began waving at me, they began to honk their horns too. I've kept on doing it all these years because it makes people feel good. And if I can make someone happy, I think I'm doing something great. A lesson we can all learn from Mr. Charles is that when you get a message from your heart, it's very important to trust it, to go for it. Too many of us go through our lives being limited because we're always concerned about what other people might think. We live more in our heads than in our hearts. Mr. Charles told me that when he started, even his wife thought he was crazy. He said, "My wife looked out the window the day I started and shouted out to me, 'Joseph, come in the house. You must be crazy to do that. What are you doing?' No, she really didn't like what I did at all until she and I went to Burbank, California and appeared on Real People. Her friends saw her on national television, and then she became interested in what I was doing." Mr. Charles has also appeared on such shows as Good Morning America and Evening Magazine. But his real joy comes from the simple act of making others a little happier. I noticed that Mr. Charles was wearing a cross, so I asked him about his beliefs. Was he a religious man? And he went on to say, "Well, I'll tell you that I'm not a church-going member or anything like that, but there is a God and I believe in God. Sometimes I feel Jesus inside me. It makes me feel good. It gives me great spirit and releases me from my worries that I might have. I've never had much education, but I do know how to treat people. I treat them just like I want them to treat me. I don't want anybody to hurt me, and I'm not going to do anything to hurt anyone." All of us know the golden rule, but I've rarely met anyone who puts it into practice with the same commitment Mr. Charles does. He does not have many years of formal education, but there's one higher degree that I felt he demonstrated with every part of his being. He had a PhD in love. Mr. Charles is a wonderful example of what I said before. You're never too old to make a difference, but you're never too young to make a difference either. Now let me tell you a delightful, heartwarming story about an ordinary young man who was already doing extraordinary things. In Philadelphia, an 11-year-old boy named Trevor Farrell was watching television one night when he saw a story on the news about street people. His heart ached when he saw these people sleeping on the streets on that bitterly cold night. Although it was late, he told his parents that he wanted to go to these people that night and help them. He just knew there must be something that he and his parents could do to help. His father was pleased that his son was sensitive to the street people's suffering and that he wanted to help, but it was very late and everyone was tired. Trevor, however, still wanted to go. He was not going to believe in any kind of limitation in following what his heart was telling him to do. Trevor wouldn't let up until finally his parents agreed to take him to the center of Philadelphia where the television program had shown the street people were living. Trevor took a single yellow blanket and a pillow from his bed. While they were driving, he pressed the blanket and pillow against the car heater to warm them. As they turned a corner in the city, Trevor saw a man sleeping on the street on top of an iron grating. He called out to his father to stop the car. Then he got out, walked up to the man, and knelt beside him and handed him the blanket. "Here, sir," he told the man, "here's a blanket for you." And then he went back to the car and brought the man the pillow. The man's face lit up with one of the biggest smiles Trevor had ever seen. "Thank you," the man said. "God bless you." "God bless you," Trevor replied. Trevor and his parents were all deeply moved by this experience. So the next night, the night after that, they came back, bringing more blankets and also hot coffee. But even this was not enough for Trevor. He kept telling his parents that there must be something more they could do. There seemed to be no way this boy was going to give up his idea of helping the homeless. He never sat down and drew up a logical plan of what to do, but he did follow his heart. Trevor began putting up posters all over town asking for donations to help the street people. The response could not have been more heartwarming. People from everywhere brought warm clothes and blankets and piled them in Trevor's garage. One person even donated a Volkswagen van so that they could take the donations to the people who were so desperately needing them. Over time, Trevor's campaign, as it became to be known, was helping to feed and clothe and even provide housing for the homeless people in the inner city. There just seemed to be no stopping the enthusiasm and generosity that people from the community showed once Trevor had gotten things started. Everyone began to feel better about themselves. School children, business people, and even people from high society showed up to volunteer their time. And even the most complacent and doubtful people began to learn that they too could make a difference. People of all ages turned up to help, not only by giving money, but by touching the hearts of the people around them who needed their assistance. One day, Trevor's father found a handwritten letter that had been left in the van they used to take the food and clothing to the street people. The letter was reprinted in the book Trevor's Place by Frank and Janet Farrell, which was published by Harper and Row in 1985. And it told the story of how this person had lost everything he had ever valued in life and was now living in the streets. All hope seemed to have gone from him. The rest of the letter told how all this had changed, and let me quote from it. "Suddenly, there in front of me stood a little boy with a face of spring, who gave me a respectful, 'Here, sir, I have a blanket for you.' He had given me more than a blanket. He gave me new hope. I could not keep back the tears. I fell in love with that little boy named Trevor, and at the same time, I fell in love again with life." There are many more stories I could tell you about adults and children who have made a difference. But the point is that age does not have to be a limiting factor. When you truly believe that nothing's impossible, then indeed nothing is impossible. Unfortunately, many of us, as we reach our later years, spend a lot of time reliving the past or are absorbed in our fears about the future. At one time in my life, I had some fears about getting older, and I had fears about limitations that I might experience. Now, I not only believe, but I know that there will always be an unlimited source of creative love energy in my heart, just waiting to be tapped. I do believe that the secret to tapping that fire of compassionate love on a continuing basis is to ask the question, throughout every second of the day, how can I be more helpful and more loving to others? I remember a 14-year-old boy named Will, who was close to death, giving advice to other kids with cancer, and he said, "As long as we're breathing, no matter what is happening to our bodies, our main job is to give love to others." One of the many wonderful things that children teach us is that solutions to problems don't have to have complicated answers. They remind us that love is the answer to all of our problems. They remind us that helping hands, caring hearts, and the compassion to want to be truly helpful to others can do much to bring about a more loving and peaceful world. As you've listened to the stories in these tapes, I'm certain that many of you have wished that you too can make a difference. Well, you can, and you can do it today. How? How can we make a difference? Within each of our hearts is an endless list of creative things that we can do. This list is revealed to us simply by asking ourselves each day how we might be more helpful to others and what we might do to bring about more light and love to our planet. So now, Let me show you how to make a beginning. Here is a list of questions to ask yourself, and things you can do right now to make a difference. 1. I shall ask each day what I can do to be more helpful to others. 2. I shall ask each day, what can I do to bring more light and loving to this planet of ours? 3. I will visualize in my mind an image of the kind of world I'd like to live in. 4. I will be reminded that my thoughts as well as my actions help determine the kind of world I live in. Thus, I shall ask for help each day to let go of all my attack thoughts and actions and have them replaced with only loving thoughts and actions. 5. I shall ask what I might do each day to help our handicapped, our elderly, our sick, and our children. 6. I will do at least one thing to improve the environment. 7. I will ask myself what I might do this day in my family, my school, my place of work, and during my leisure hours to make the world a better place to live. 8. There's a wonderful organization called the Giraffe for people who are willing to stick their necks out and make the world a better place to live. I, too, will ask myself how I might stick my neck out to make a difference. 9. I will either make a phone call or tell someone in person how much I love them. 10. I will think of someone I've not forgiven and will have a willingness to forgive them today. I would like to add, I think it would be helpful if you chose to write to the Caring Institute, that's C-A-R-I-N-G Institute in Washington, D.C. They're located at 318 A Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C. And this is an institute that's just involved in bringing a more caring attitude to the world. I would like to urge you to ask yourself these above questions each day, and to make these resolutions each day, and then to act on them. Giving truly is receiving, and you will be helping yourself at least as much as you'll be helping others. This is God's way, and our way to spread joy and love and peace throughout the world. Yes, I know sometimes it can seem difficult, but as I think you've heard from the stories in these tapes, it's really nowhere near as hard as it might appear at first. The time has come to let go of fear, because fear is the cause of apathy and indifference to suffering in this world. The time has come to awaken to the truth that our own suffering begins to dissolve the minute we reach out our hand to be helpful to another soul. The time has come for each of us to have faith and to trust in love. The time has come to stop being afraid of love and to see the light of love and nothing else in each other and in ourselves. We heal ourselves, our relationships, and the planet when we become aware that each of us truly does make a significant difference when we make it our top priority to live each moment finding more creative ways for being a little kinder, a little more tender, gentle, helpful, and loving to each other and to ourselves.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.